Sa amin, it's so basic po eh. If the reality is that corporations are increasing their profitability on the back of improving worker productivity, it's a no-brainer that the workers should have a share of that increase in productivity in terms of higher wages. Unfortunately, even before the pandemic, but of course made worse by the pandemic, under the Duterte administration, wages did not even keep up with the rising prices of goods and services. Actually, also being replicated right now under the Marcos Jr. administration. So sa
Mm.
amin, the most basic thing is come from a realization, can workers afford to live on their wage? Clearly, they can't. Our own computation, the family living wage is about 1,133. We are so wondering why the NWPC stopped computing the family living wage. I mean, it's the most basic thing sana. I mean, if the Department of Labor is going to stand up for labor, it should continue actually its own computations of the family living wage. But they stopped that. Pero para sa amin, as a benchmark for what the workers should be receiving, it should be the family living wage, and then put the burden of proof on employers to say if they can afford it or not. Because one thing we realize when we do help out with the labor groups when they negotiate with the NWPC, for some reason the burden seems to be always on the worker to prove that the employer can afford it. Para sa amin, after this long drawn out problem of real wages falling over the last 15 years, dapat i-shift yun. Maybe it will be better for the government to take the side of the workers and then help the workers get a justification from the employers if they can afford it or not. And I think that will nudge up wages upward somehow. That will somehow increase purchasing power, increase more money in the economy. And I think help not just worker families, but also help the communities they're in, the informal self-employed in their communities, and sort of get a bit, spur a bit more economic recovery instead of it being concentrated in the hands of a few corporations. Last point
Okay.
then po, it's so amazing that in the face of this pandemic, in the face of falling real wages, we did a quick check of executive pay. Executive pay has been increasing in the last 2 years. I mean, that's not even to talk about oligarch wealth. So para sa amin, it seems that if executive compensation can increase, if their benefits and basic salaries can increase, siguro naman a little bit of a higher increase can be afforded for their workers.
How different is the system in other countries compared to the Philippines? Kasi sa akin, parang
Mhm.
pinagmumula natin, amo, senyorito, senyora, culture eh. Mga
Mhm.
feudal culture, farms, mga family-based organizations. So talagang parang may utang na loob ka pa. You should be grateful that we give you a job, and so people will always be resistant to giving salary increases. But how do they do it in other countries? Is it through legislation? Is there formula, etc., so that employers and employees don't have to argue and shout at each other every time there is a need to increase salaries?
Well, actually, wage systems are so varied. Out of about 200 countries in the world, wage systems vary. We have, of course, as we do have in the Philippines, but that's also very different in a country like, for example, where we are right now in Switzerland. Also very different from a country like South Africa or Brazil or India or wherever else. I think it's hard to generalize, but I think at the Philippines level of development, in terms of yung relatively low institutional capacity, meaning in terms of yung extent of legislation, the budget for the for the labor department to actually monitor wage hikes. I think we're more or less in the same level of maybe a country like Brazil or Argentina or perhaps even South Africa. And sa amin, the way to develop that system for better wage setting actually can be done. I think South Africa is a good model. They have a legislated national minimum wage. So despite also being a large country, despite having very varied industries, despite a wide geographic discrepancies, supposedly even among job opportunities and incomes, they were able to legislate quite recently a higher national minimum wage. So I think that's something that the Philippines can aspire for, at least have a a better base, kumbaga, for
Mhm.
workers to work with. And then that actually gives strength to the workers vis-a-vis employers. And that's actually, I think, the crux of any labor debate naman eh. Where does the government side in terms of its arbitration, if it's acting as an arbiter, or in terms
Mhm.
of the policies it makes? And I think legislation is a good way to go kasi it institutionalizes a certain wage level for the workers na
Okay.
na may basic minimum.
Is the resistance to wage increases based on greed or fear and apprehension that if we give you an inch, you will want a hand. If we give you a hand, you will want an arm or a leg. Kasi may mga kumpanyang ganyan na nakakausap ko and they say, we actually want to give. But the problem is, we're in this CBA, collective bargaining agreement. If we're generous now, they will certainly demand even more in the future. In your assessment of the Philippines, is it greed on the part of the companies or is it fear and apprehension?
I don't want to speculate on motivation, but I think what's very clear, whether it's coming from greed or some kind of misplaced apprehension, the bottom line is I think employers are capitalists, and it's been studied. It's been studied through so many ideological lenses. Capital always wants to make a profit. So I think, again, whatever the specifics of motivation, whatever's running through their heads, the bottom line is every employer, every capitalist will want to increase their stock of capital by lowering wages. And I think that's a better way to start than judging whether it's greed or apprehension. Because if you start on the reality, employers will always want to increase their profits even at the expense of the workers. On the other hand, workers will always want to increase their wages, perhaps even with less recognition of the capacity of capital. That's where the government comes in. So I think the point about the institutionalization of a wage practice, that's why it's so important for the government, because basically they're at odds. Capital and labor will always be at odds. They'll be fighting over whatever was produced by labor, and the government has to take sides. And I think that's why it's important to have it legislated, to have clear parameters for what sets the wage. Actually, the government does have a definition of the family living wage. And then if it's legislated, wala nang away yun. Like I said nga, yung usapin ng apprehension, may resolve kasi the parameters are clear. The benchmarks are clear. The metrics for assessing kung is it justified to raise or not are going to be there. So,
May
pero right now,
protection.
and may clarity, di ba?